Okay, so welcome to this first episode of Flight Path. I'm here with Stephane and Emptage. Stephane and I first met when he joined Makers to retrain as a software developer. At the time, I was aware of Stephane's background as a social worker, and he's gone on to build his skills within software development, work in gaming, and work in fintech. Stephane, before we dive in, what do you want people to know about you and your journey?
Well, definitely been an interesting one. Lots of ups and downs, but it's been a good one actually. Because I wanted to sort of transition from. Well, I really wanted to get into coding for a long time, but I was caught in a bit of a situation where I'd already been to uni. How do I get into it? Um, and I luckily found out about a place called Makers that did apprenticeships. And it was a bit of a big jump because I was going from um, I was living around Lancaster at the time, and I had to, for a lot of the jobs for makers to get onto the apprenticeship scheme, everything was sort of London based. So I took a few, I did a few meetings with them, and I went down, did some interviews at a few places, and when I did eventually get something, it was basically sell your car, get on the train, find somewhere to live a week or two before, and off you go, which is quite a big change. But yeah, really exciting to get an opportunity like that and to find out it's out there really.
Yeah, it's a huge jump. So before you went into the apprenticeships, had you played about with coding in any way? What did that look like?
Yeah, I'd sort of messed around in a game engine called Unity and tried to learn a few things. But the challenge is sort of if you're trying to self-teach, but you don't really have a great understanding of like, well, where's this going, and what, how do I get into that kind of role without sort of having a qualification or all those types of things. It sort of ends up being a bit nebulous, and it's hard to kind of gauge, how much do I need to learn? When am I at a level that I could apply for stuff? Because I know with development, some people do go into it just totally self-taught, and they can find ways into it that way. But it's also very difficult because a lot of businesses expect a bit of understanding of kind of more the ways of managing code, like using Git and doing like how pipelines work, and maybe having a bit of business knowledge that you are quite sort of lacking really if you just self teach really.
Hmm. So when you think about like the early bit of your career, what was it that you dreamt of doing?
Oh, well, work for a games company was a big one. Um, I still would quite like to work for get like a sort of big games company. There's a few that I really like. That sort of in unfortunately like very different places on the planet. Um, but obviously it's an interesting industry because there's a lot of turnover. The pay isn't great. Um, and there's a lot of challenges in that industry at the moment. So it's something I'm still very interested in, but there's also that other element of, there's a lot of challenges around it. Um, but I think one of the things as well was just to do coding really and see if I could do it, because I was never really particularly amazing at maths, for example, um, as a kid. Although I have a bit of a theory about maths that I think abstract thinking is kind of something that some people develop skills in later in life, I think. Um, but that's a whole other debate, really.
I was gonna say, what is your maths theory?
I think, like a lot of kids, in terms of like abstract understanding, like being able to understand abstract things like algebra, for example, I think that's something that some people come to earlier than others, but I think a lot of people are quite capable of it, but more when they're a bit older. Um, yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, really. Although
Yeah.
I am someone who's like kind of I was diagnosed with like dyspraxia and dyslexia, so there might be an element of as I've got older, I've got more coping mechanisms to approach things, and I'm better at managing all that, I suppose. Yeah.
Perhaps. I think sometimes it's a little bit of knowing what's gonna help that land for somebody.
Yeah.
I think maths in particular is probably one that I've got my own theories about because when I was in
Mm.
primary school, um, I was exceptionally good at maths, but it was
Mm.
also because there was one of the parents that took a group of us out. We were kind of playing recorders into these instruments at Cambridge University labs and having it
Mm.
explained to us in a way that made perfect sense to somebody in primary school
Yeah.
and covering the same thing at secondary school and just I don't even know that the explanation was a million miles away from
Mm.
anything that I could find tangible. But in the meantime, I'd forgotten it, and I kind of did pick it up again because I knew it when I was in primary school.
Yeah.
I do think there's something about breaking it out into somebody's language that they've got enough context to grab onto it.
I think that's true actually, because I think one of the difficulties of maths is it's very like, how can I put it? Like there's a lot of different routes to problem solving the same thing,
Mm.
and so like some kids might go in a direction that solves the problem, but it's not quite what they're the way in which they're being taught, and that can be quite tricky because it's sort of just different avenues down. Do you know what I mean? To the same answer, really.
Mm. So you're kind of thinking around maths and like how accessible it felt to you.
Hmm.
That influence like the decisions that you took in your career.
I think so, because I think one of the problems I had a little bit growing up, I suppose, was that I was like particularly good at sort of English, even though even though I'm a bit dyslexic. I was actually quite good at English and kind of arts and things like that. Not art, but like music and that kind of thing. Um, and I was also quite, I think, historically quite good with people, and that's why I ended up, doing a master's in social work in the end. But that was kind of a play to your strengths thing, but not play to what you actually want to do. Um, and yeah, I think sometimes it's good getting out of your comfort zone, actually thinking about what you want to do rather than just kind of being pessimistic about whether you're capable of doing stuff, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of people are quite capable of, especially with coding, like to learn to code. It might take a bit longer. It might be, you might have your own challenges, but I think a lot of it is just sheer determination and grit, really, to get there with it.
Determination, grit, and it sounds like a bit of hope because you're saying like there's not
Yeah.
pessimism that holds you back.
Mm.
If you kind of look at your journey, what are the standout moments that shaped your career?
Oh. Um. I think sort of. So I think there's a couple. I think like when I decided to go for the apprenticeship, I was kind of at a point where I was a bit. I enjoyed the job I was doing because I was working in child protection, but there was also an element of, ooh, is this it for me? Is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? Um, and I was looking to, I was keen on doing coding, and I think I got to a point where it was kind of you're either just going to kind of accept this is it, or you're going to take a risk. And I suppose it got to the point where the risk outweighed just staying doing the same thing. So it's kind of like, well, what else can you do? It's probably a bit more. It's a bit depressing to just accept something and not try and change things. So I was quite lucky in a way because I'd not hit rock bottom, but I'd hit a point where I was kind of like the alternative was much worse than taking the risk. So I just went for it. Um, I suppose another point was COVID was a big one. So um, obviously there's a few challenges like on the apprenticeship because COVID hit, um, and me and the other apprentice put on furlough for a while, and we both were catching up every day, coding our own little project for quite a few months to make sure we're still learning. But unfortunately, a lot of people sort of ended up getting let go, and the apprentices were the people that definitely took a hit on that. And we I think with your help, we kind of navigated that, and we were able to eventually finish the apprenticeship, which was really positive because it was a very tricky time in terms of that. And I think, I think with your help and also um, sort of a lot of grit and determination, we kind of got there in the end.
Yeah, I've got to give
Yeah.
you both of you props on that because I think you had just taken this phenomenal approach to furlough, which is we're going to try and build something with the time that we have,
Mm,
not like I'm going to check out.
yeah.
So I think it like the fact that you put so much work in
Mm,
um, really helped that case because it was kind of unprecedented
yeah. Oh
in
wow.
many ways. Well, I don't think anyone had really foreseen
Yeah.
lockdown happening.
Mm,
And a lot of the new apprenticeships are new. So even like BCS that managed the apprenticeship, I think it was
mm,
just kind of how do we respond to this thing that nobody saw coming?
yeah.
And it probably would have been a very like it was a bit of a fight, but it probably would have been a very different outcome had it not
Mm,
been for the fact that kind of you and the other apprentice just kind of yeah, you had grit,
mm.
determination, and that motivation to continue coding through it.
I was lucky because he was very, I think similar to me, very, very keen to get somewhere with coding and very determined, and that really helped as well because we sort of bounced off each other quite a lot, which was great, really.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
So of this, like of because we've talked a little bit about like hope and some
Hmm.
of the point where things kind of changed for you. What is the decision or a couple of decisions that you made that were scary but they paid off?
Yeah, I think obviously moving was quite a big one because it was kind of just pack up your life and off you go. Um, I think another one was like after the apprenticeship, you've got that challenge then of, how am I, I need to get a job. It's my first job, trying to get into development. Um, and I think that was an interesting period because I mean, I ended up working for a call center for a brief while, and I was doing a lot of like sort of learning a lot of coding and stuff on the side. And then I had a bit of a strategy of I really want to work at a games company. I was maybe a bit too naive about about how much I could learn. Um, but so in a sort of 3 months, I did like a load of C++ courses and uh, Unreal Engine stuff, and then I applied. I actually took this like really crazy um, look at, or how can I work at a games company? So I took this sort of weird approach where I thought, right, okay, let's find every games company in the UK, write them all down, see if any of them have any job openings, and for those that don't, either ring them up or email them, and just absolutely hammer like loads of different countries with application companies, sorry, with applications. Um, and surprisingly, I got a few interviews at some like genuinely like quite well known studios. I wasn't quite good enough at the time, but I'd managed to sort of get my foot in the door, which was quite interesting.
Mm.
Um, I did end up working at a kind of a sort of gambling game company for 6 months for a while. Um, and then later on, I sort of ended up working somewhere else at a bank. But yeah, it's interesting because you start learning. I think what helped a lot from Makers was because it was very much focused on, kind of how can I put it, like kind of you're capable of anything. It was quite, it
Mm.
was, it's quite good because you start learning that in terms of applying for jobs and all that kind of stuff, it's much more about like there's a lot of ways to approach it, and I think a lot of people come out of school and continue to think, oh, I have to do kind of my CV in a very specific way that you learn at school and you go and do it, that way. But I started learning when I was applying for game jobs. I was like, oh, well, maybe I need to fancy it up, use some colors, put a picture on. sort of change my approach to how I'm doing it, because I think a lot of people don't make the connection that someone's looking at your CV, what are they looking for, as opposed to like, oh, I need to do it in a formulaic way.
Hmm. It's
Um,
really interesting. It's like, how do you tell that story that will live off the page?
yeah, yeah.
And I think when you talk about kind of having different colors, and so I actually wouldn't recommend people put picture on their CV because it's kind of that first line of bias, they're getting everything.
Yeah.
But also what's happened in maybe the past like 4 or 5 years is that there's now this huge rise of applicant tracking systems. So
Mm,
I'm gonna like do a session on Wednesday about how to get your CV past those machines.
yeah.
If you've got like a beautiful CV with different columns and pictures, as soon as it goes into this machine, the machine passes it and it doesn't even pass things where you expect them to be, or it's
Wow.
gappy. So, like it was interesting for me because I have access to one, so I put it through,
Mm,
put mine through there, and it's like, oh, I need to shift how I'm talking about some of these things because I also
yeah.
like, and I don't know if this is the case for you, but I've worked in a lot of startup environments, so I had lots of things about building foundations,
Mm,
and it produced this word cloud, and on this word cloud, a fairly large was construction, and I'm like, I've never worked in construction.
uh,
So that kind of made me think, oh, okay, maybe I need to shift around how I'm talking about my CV. But it's interesting that you decided to go for that approach of I'm going to shortlist where I want to work and
mm,
then just hammer them.
yeah.
When you think about that kind of journey from qualifying to landing somewhere as a junior,
Mm.
what were the biggest learnings in that?
Well, I think confidence is like huge. So I think the biggest battle I've always had with coding, but like less and less so now, is imposter syndrome, um, and confidence. And confidence can really impact your ability to code because you can kind of hamstring yourself, um, feeling like, oh, I can't figure this out myself. Like, how do I, like a bit overwhelmed and all those kind of things. Um, and so, it's a challenge as well because, especially sometimes you're working with developers who, might not be the most patient. So that can also kind of cause stress because maybe you get a bit scared about code reviews or you're getting different opinions from different people every time. So you do one thing in one style and then someone else doesn't like it. So they need to go back and, all those kind of little challenges. But I think the fundamental one is confidence because I think that really can be a big. I don't think it's a blocker on progression totally, like in terms of learning and stuff, but I think it does slow you down.
Mhm.
Yeah.
When you think about that place of like maybe not being that confident because it's new
Mm.
and you're getting varying opinions, like knowing what you know now, how would you advise somebody to navigate those first months, year of that world?
I suppose there's a couple of ways. Um, I think there's an element of you have to sort of try and put up with the difficulties a little bit. Um, I think you also have to be careful not to spin yourself into a point where you're like my manager um, at the company I worked at on my apprenticeship was actually really said something to me that I thought was actually really good. He said, "I only want you to work 9 till 5:30 or whatever my hours were at the time. Do not work longer than that because you'll have diminishing returns and it will burn you out." And I actually think that's really good advice because I think some people get into a bit of a spin and then they'll start working really late every night and then they'll get burnt out and they'll get really stressed and all those kind of things. So you have to take care of yourself as well. And I think it is a real struggle as a junior because you are kind of in a situation where you're a little bit at the mercy of of the people around you as well. So you are in a position where you've got a lot to learn, and there's a lot of systems to learn, and it's going to be quite overwhelming. So I think really it's about trying to keep a positive vibe, really, and if you can, find someone who's a good mentor that can give you a bit of advice, and kind of can help steer you in the right direction with things as well. And also try and work at kind of, with a lot of problems, well, with all problems in coding, you can totally solve them yourself. It might take you a bit longer when you're a junior, but it's trying to get into a mindset of being a bit more measured about problems instead of getting super flustered, which I think is something that I definitely struggled with earlier on in my career.
When you say you can solve them yourself, would you
Mm.
advocate for people taking the time to unpick it, or knowing when to maybe ask a mentor?
So I think that's the thing. I sort of have a bit of a rule in my head that if I can't if I'm stuck on like a really tricky problem for like 3 or 4 hours, there kind of comes a point where it's like, okay, maybe I need to like bounce this off someone else. I have that less and less as I've coded for longer, but really, I think that I'm trying to remember what it was called. Makers, I think we learned this around this idea that you have. I think it's like there's a couple of circles. There's like the one in the middle where it's like the coding you're doing is like super easy. You know what you're doing. You're kind of confident, and there's another ring that's kind of around like you're being stretched, so it's a little bit more difficult, but you're probably gonna figure it out, and it's a really good area to be in because you're gonna learn stuff. And then there's that kind of outer ring that's kind of this is going to be this is actually maybe a little bit too hard, and you might need to ask someone's opinion. And I suppose, yeah, it's knowing when to pull the trigger on that as well, because if you do it too early, then you might not learn anything. And I think there's an element of coding that you need to suffer a little bit, because you'll learn a lot from that pain in a way. But you also need to know when to ask for help, I think. Yeah.
And can you talk to me a little bit about like mentorship in coding?
Mm. So I'm actually doing like a lot more of that now. Um, I did a little bit at Makers actually for a little while because they employed me for a few months to do that, which was a really good experience. A bit scary because like some of the apprentices were like wildly like super advanced, so they were quite it's quite interesting to do. Um, but um, but nowadays, like yeah, we have a couple of juniors that I spend a lot of time with. And actually, what I try and do, um, I think because I had my challenges when I was learning to code, and I knew certain things helped and certain things didn't, is actually doing a lot of pairing. I think it's really important because I think people learn a lot by being included, um, and giving people the space to kind of, yeah, to feel comfortable approaching you and asking questions. Because I get that it can be frustrating when you're being bombarded with questions, or it's easy to get annoyed if someone kind of doesn't know as much as you. I can kind of understand that. I can see why people get annoyed, but actually you're doing that person no favors by showing that frustration, or sort of being sort of toxic with them, really. And I think actually that person will improve so much more if you give them the time and you're patient, um, and you sort of make them feel comfortable, really. I mean, and have that open dialogue where they feel free to speak about things, and um, all that kind of stuff, really, and understanding the individual. So I've got one junior that I work with that I think maybe benefits a lot from pairing, um, and another that benefits a bit from pairing, but actually they quite like to do it themselves and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of judging different learning styles, and how can you help these people that you're working with in different ways.
Mm. Oh, I'm really hearing from you is like that the importance of connection in that, and the soft skill of
Mm.
like being able to read people. And you said earlier on that you're really good with people. So it doesn't surprise me that you're able to kind of drop into that connection and understand that this person is going to be far more experiential and this person is going to kind of benefit from that peer learning and seeing
Mm.
things like up close. I'm really interested to know kind of, and in the day and age we're in, can't get
Yeah.
away without asking an AI question,
Oh
but
yeah, that's a good one actually.
but like the role that technology has played um, from when you began to where we are now.
Oh, I have a love-hate relationship with that actually. I think, oh, that's a deep question though. I think there's a snake oily salesman thing to it a little bit in certain ways. I think it is drastically going to change industry for sure. I think things like Gemini, ChatGPT, and stuff are really, really useful to developers. I think they can be great learning tools. They can help, you know, they can help you learn more about coding. Um, but I think there's that element of like, I think they're really good. Do I think they're going to replace developers anytime soon? Probably not. Um, the only problem with them as a tool is, especially for a junior, is it's quite tempting to try and get AI to write code for you, and that's not really the way to do it because you learn nothing, and often your code won't probably work that well, or it won't. You know, there are a lot of challenges with doing stuff like that, and actually, the best way to use it is more as a learning thing. So actually, sort of asking questions on sort of specific things that you're having problems with, it's an amazing tool and it can give you more context around something. But yeah, I do worry that sometimes it could become a crutch. It's a very easy tool, like especially as a junior, to like rely on in that sense, just sort of using it to do stuff for you rather than trying to use it as a learning tool.
When people have used Chat GPT, for example, um, can you see it in the code? Because if I'm thinking about LinkedIn, I know chat loves some certain phrases. So I wonder if it did the
Yeah.
same thing in code.
Uh, I think it can. I think it can be because I think it does like sometimes auto generate comments and things. So there is an element of like you can you can sometimes see like the comments written maybe not what you would expect from the person that you're code reviewing. Um and sometimes if it does something really clever, like really, really clever, and it works. Like sometimes it can be really good at doing stuff like that. It can be quite good at refining code as well. If you've written something that works and you want to, sort of make it a bit better, you can always run it through it and see what it spits back and see if it's. But but yeah, I think there are certain like giveaways potentially that can happen. I think sometimes as well, if people are just using it for everything, then it starts to become obvious that it's not that's how it's being used, I suppose.
So if
Um,
somebody was in like a code test and an interview and they were using Chat GPT, do you think that it would be a dead giveaway?
it depends if I could see their screen. Is it really difficult? No, maybe not. I mean, I think this is the problem, isn't it? When it's already very difficult to gauge someone's ability when you're interviewing them for a role, um, because a lot of people lie on their CVs, and if they can have a second screen and do stuff there, it's a little bit tricky. But then it's a very difficult thing to kind of. There's sort of a weird aspect to it, isn't there? I mean, in terms of like, should a programmer, for like a tech test, not use the tools available to them when they will in the job? I mean, I guess that's more like that's the tricky question to answer, really. Um, I think the thing that worries me sometimes with it is it can mask whether someone understands something or not. So you could probably use it to try and pass tech tests and then not really know what you've done or why it works.
Mm.
And then you're in a whole heap of bother when you start the job because you've kind of found a way to get it, but then you don't really know how to do the job. I suppose it's very difficult.
And how to troubleshoot
Yeah,
if anything goes wrong.
yeah.
When you think about like technology in your role, what's become invaluable to the way that you work?
I think again confidence actually, in like knowing that you can solve a problem even if you don't know right then and there. And also I guess the ability to work with other people and share knowledge. Um, because I think especially if you've got juniors on your team that you're wanting to train up, like giving them time, while it is in a way a drain on your resources and your time, like giving them time, it's kind of not because you're getting to a point where they're going to become self-sufficient. So it's a really good investment of time. Um, and I think what's helped me a lot as well, like with mentoring in particular, is I think because I have my own challenges kind of learning to code, it's a lot easier to sympathize with people that are starting out and what some of the challenges they have. Um, and I suppose the other element in my job at the moment is I work at a bank that has a very small dev team, and I'm having to hop around across loads of stuff. So I do coding in Salesforce. Then a lot of my coding is in JavaScript as well. So I'm hopping between like a language called Apex, which is basically
Mhm.
Java, and I'm also doing JavaScript, and then I'm doing loads of stuff in AWS. So the although it's in some ways there's negatives of being in a small team, there's a lot of benefits because you're having to hop between code consistently to totally different things that do different things, and that's really really good for learning, I think.
Wow. I was also intrigued to know, like, when you are mentoring other people, has that
Hmm.
improved your code?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I also think pairing with people, even if they're just watching your screen or you're watching theirs is really good because if you're showing someone something you're working on, you initially probably have to tell them what you're doing and why you're doing it and how the thing you're showing them works, um, which is really good actually because you might through the process of doing that go, oh, I could do this a different way, or they might ask a question that makes you think, oh yeah, maybe I could approach it differently. Actually, that's an interesting like perspective. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that, and um, I think this idea that a mid-level dev or a senior dev has nothing to learn from a junior is not really true. Um, I think you can always learn from other people. And a lot of the time they'll spot things that maybe you haven't, because one of the great things about pairing is you get so when you're working on a problem, you get so engrossed in the problem, and if you've got an error coming up or something, you're so like tunnel visiony on whatever you're looking at that actually maybe the issue you've got is something really simple, like, oh, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, maybe I've not referenced a variable properly, or I'm trying to think of a really sort of simple thing that someone else might pick up on, but you're so tunnel visiony that you haven't really stood back and looked at it.
See the wood for the trees.
Yeah, yeah.
So as you look back at your journey across social work and then moving into development, what are you most grateful for?
Oh, I think very much the apprenticeship really, and all the people that worked with me along that journey, because it was pretty touch and go at one point over COVID. Um, and it would have been pretty rough if I hadn't finished the apprenticeship. It would have been quite, I mean, it still would have been possible, but it would have been kind of a lot harder to get a job afterwards. I would have thought much more challenging. So, I think obviously, obviously you helped a lot with that. The other apprentice I worked with also was a great inspiration working with him because he was very driven. He helped keep me driven, um, and all of that. And I think a lot of the things that make us thought around, I guess, sort of mindfulness and looking after yourself and all those types of things. Everyone's got a different journey, kind of thing. Was really helpful along the way. So yeah, I think those are probably the main things that have, yeah.
Yeah, that idea that like kind of comparison is a thief of joy. So
Yeah,
your path is your path.
yeah.
What advice would you give to people that are kind of thinking about navigating their own career?
Ooh, I suppose try and approach things with a. It's really easy to say because I think the biggest problem's like imposter syndrome, but I think like, oh, I don't know, like just try and keep the faith, I suppose, in yourself. I think that's the biggest thing, and also know that there's options out there all the time, really. I mean, I think the challenges in some jobs and workplaces, throughout your career, you're going to have situations where you might work somewhere where the environment's not great, or you don't feel that you're learning much, perhaps. And really, in those situations, you've got to think about, right, well, what can I do to improve it? Maybe I need to find another job, or well, yeah, I think that's probably the main one. But being confident to take risks as well, because what's the worst thing that can happen? I think I've had this with the apprenticeship. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Well, you don't progress with it or whatever, it all goes wrong, but then you can just get another job. I mean, you're not tied to a job that's not your full life. You've got, a lot of these problems will be water under the bridge like 2 weeks after you move jobs. So I think those are all interesting things to consider. Yeah.
I think it's in the moment, it doesn't always feel like it. Like,
No.
and it can feel very all-encompassing.
Yes.
Um, and then hopefully at some point there's that little switch of like, oh, I actually do have the power to wrestle this back and change it.
Yeah, and I think sort of not letting people get you down or I mean, that's obviously incredibly easier said than done, really. Um, but yeah, and I think sort of taking care of yourself's a big one, really.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I have a kind of deep understanding that like we create our reality moment to moment.
Mm,
So, and that goes for us having an amazing time and it goes for us being really stressed. It's kind of like our response to moment. And it's so difficult to remember that at times. Like it's just, you don't see it at all.
yeah.
So when people are talking about you and working with you, like, how would you want to be remembered?
Um, Hopefully someone that has kind of helped them with their own career development, I suppose, and helped them, I think especially in the context of coding, like giving them the space to learn, but also been someone that's approachable. Because I've certainly had my challenges like earlier in my career where it was hard for me to learn, perhaps because I didn't have like a good mentor or someone to talk to, which isn't the case now. I've got a really good mentor actually. But yeah, I think yeah, I'd hope that I would have helped people along with their own careers as well, and sort of made a bit of a difference in that sense, really.
I love that idea of like being what you want to see in the world and kind of filling that gap that maybe you didn't have as well.
Yeah.
And then my very last question for you is kind of what would you like to bring into being? What's your kind of dream to create in the world?
Oh wow, that was really tricky. um, the demise of social media. No, I don't know. I'd love. I mean, I've talked a lot about earlier on about I'd like to get into gaming, but I'd love to work on something in terms of code and also story writing for like quite a narrative driven game. Because I really like telling stories and I like consuming stories. And I think sort of maybe just bringing joy to people, I suppose, with like an experience. I think that's what I mean, in my free time, I do a lot of music as well. So I record music and do all that kind of stuff. I just quite like creating things and seeing what people think, I suppose. So yeah, I guess that's it. I don't know, nothing too world changing. I'm not sure I can save the world particularly, but I think
So there's an idea of this narrative story. Do you know what that story would be about, even, or is that under wrapped until it's born?
oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I really like the role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade, because it has all this like really mad mythology to it. Um, and yeah, a few years ago, I got to do some role playing with a few friends online. I love the idea of creating a kind of choose your own adventure where you can make decisions and all that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, I think that's because I kind of feel games can very much be art. They're not quite seen that way at the moment by everyone, but I think that's becoming more of a thing over time. So yeah, I think it's a good way of storytelling, and I also think you can do quite a lot with sort of metaphors like linking back to what's happening in the world at the moment, or all sorts of things, and or maybe even just getting back to sort of I don't know, sort of hope and positive messages really in that sense. Just giving people something to enjoy really away from you know the real world sometimes or politics.
I love
Yeah,
that. So like creating some positivity in the world. That's really nice.
yeah, yeah.
And I'll have to like show you something about Sukion, which is
Oh.
Trinidad's version of a vampire.
Hmm.
Travel as a fireball.
Oh, cool.
So I'll send you some of that and maybe it will make it into a future
Yeah.
thing. But
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Well, thank you so much, Stefan. That kind of brings us to a close.
Yeah.
It's been amazing to catch up and to hear your journey, and yeah, I think you leave people with that message of positivity, hope, and connecting with people. I think sometimes development seen as being really technical,
Hmm.
and in this conversation, a key theme has been actually it's still people based and it's still
Yeah.
like lifting people up and helping them on their